Plato's Symposium, like the Phaedo, is a work of tremendous cultural influence, once again largely due to its influence on the development of Christianity. The central philosophical theme is Eros, sexual love. The particular take on the erotic that was so influential is what later became known as sublimation. Sublimation, the transformation of the bodily and the sensual into something spiritual and, we might say, ethereal, otherworldly. However, the Symposium is also a complex literary work that contains layers of symbolism, irony, and self-reference that render problematic any simple statement of its intentions. It's arguably as tricky and treacherous to interpret as any work of postmodern philosophy. In addition to its seminal contribution to the philosophy of love, the Symposium is also a seminal addition to what became known as aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty, so-called aesthetic experiences, and art. Beauty is described as essentially a form, and so we also have in this work a contribution to Plato's theory of the forms. The account of beauty itself in Socrates' speech, or Diotima's, is one of Plato's most vivid and compelling, and for this reason has often been drawn upon by those attempting to understand and explain just what these mysterious forms are. In addition, this work contributes to our understanding of the personality of Socrates, who's prominently featured in it. We gather from the Symposium another side of Socrates, another side from the pious servant of the gods portrayed in the Apology, and the austere, otherworldly ascetic of the Phaedo. Here we get a portrait of, quite frankly, a very weird, but also weirdly fascinating man, who seems at times as if he comes from an alien planet. We also get the unexpected portrayal of Socrates as a great erotic, that is, as a master of the arts of love, and as a great lover. There's something bizarre, almost grotesque, in the image of Socrates as a great lover. He was known for being the precise opposite of physically attractive, and it's noted in the dialogue that he rarely bathed. The image of Socrates as a lover broaches the last of the main points of interest of the Symposium, which is the historical data it provides about the ancient Greek practice of erotic love between a man and a youth. This was a fairly unique cultural institution, which is markedly different from what we think of today when we think of a gay relationship. First, in ancient Greece at this time, marriage was assumed to be between one man and one woman, and to have the purpose of begetting and caring for children within a traditional household structure. So you have a pretty traditional view of marriage. But it was normal for respectable men to take a wife upon reaching adulthood and have sexual relations with her for the purpose of producing children, and at the same time to take an interest in a young man or youth and to have a sexual relationship and an erotic passion for the young man. So it wasn't an either or, but a both and situation. It seems that heterosexual erotic passion was possible within marriage. It'd be rather surprising if it wasn't. However, marriage, it seems, was not the site in which erotic love was typically celebrated and sought out by respectable gentlemen of this period. Instead, there was also a practice, one that was widely accepted and admired, of a mature man, who would normally be married to a woman, falling in love with and seducing a male youth. The youth was typically a male who had reached puberty, but whose beard had not yet filled in. We see some dispute over this in Possanias' speech, as far as what the appropriate age is for the beloved. The love between the mature man and the youth had a defined set of social expectations, apparently. Expectations that, if violated, would bring social condemnation and damage to one's reputation, both on behalf of the lover, the mature man who is pursuing the youth, and on behalf of the youth. There was a danger of damaging one's reputation if these social expectations were violated. First, the norm was that the love affair would be a temporary one. Its upper limit was normally set by the time in which the youth reached full adulthood, but in practice seems to have been briefer. There was prestige attached to a lover who had the ability to seduce many youths, and so this put pressure on the lover to keep each affair brief as well. But it seems that oftentimes there would be relatively long-term relationships throughout the period of the youth of this young man until he reached adulthood, and adult homosexual relationships between men were, as well as women, were not totally unknown, although they didn't fall within this celebrated form of relationship. There were definite assumptions about what the social roles in the relationship were to be. This was definitely not a symmetric relationship. It was not the kind of symmetric relationship that we today assume and take for granted a love relationship should be, whether heterosexual or homosexual. The active partner was the mature man, the lover. So in this relationship, there was one lover. If by that we mean the person who is to take the initiative in pursuing the affair. The lover is the one who takes the initiative in pursuing the affair. He had to seduce and pursue the beloved. This was also, the lover, the mature man, was the sole partner to feel any passion or desire. At least this was the ideal. This is the way it was supposed to be. Only the lover was to feel passion or desire. And he took the active role in sexual intercourse, which had to be non-penetrative to be socially respectable. The passive partner was the youth, the beloved, who was expected to resist the advances of the lover to a respectable degree before giving in. He didn't give in too quickly. That was shameful. It had to be only after a certain period of wooing and pursuit on the part of the lover. So this person was expected to be seduced, wooed, and was expected to be without any passion for the lover. So this person was supposed to be just a cold recipient of the passionate affections of the lover. And this person was also the passive partner in sex, which was expected he wouldn't derive any enjoyment from. And we see here, of course, an anticipation of the kind of Victorian ideal for heterosexual relationships, with the man in the position of the lover and the woman in the position of the beloved in the Victorian ideal. Well, many of the same things hold. We see also in Possanias' speech this sense of the double standard that was held for the lover on the one hand and the beloved on the other. That's not unlike what today, for example, you might find in American high schools, where the boy is regarded as a hero if he has many sexual contacts, but the girl is regarded as being shamed and degraded if she is promiscuous. So there's that double standard. And it seems, judging from Possanias' speech, that the same was true in this case. The lover was regarded as being heroic and admirable if he had many conquests, whereas the beloved, the youth, was looked down upon if he had many lovers. So on this ideal, the lover is supposed to obtain sexual gratification from the affair. So it's clear what he gets out of the affair. But that raises the question, of course, what did the beloved get out of it then, if he didn't get sexual gratification out of it, according to the ideal? And here's another feature of this cultural practice or institution that made it unique. The youth could expect to receive friendship and an education from the lover. The lover was a kind of life coach for the young man, equipping him intellectually and practically for his future role as a householder and citizen, with mentorship that included practical and perhaps philosophical instruction. And so this person, in other words, became a kind of protege to his lover. And so there was an educational dimension to the erotic relationship. And it seems, judging from the speeches of the symposium, that these were understood as being very intimately intertwined, sometimes to the point where they were even confused. The erotic, passionate aspect of the relationship and the educational aspect of the relationship. Apparently, it was a culturally prized benefit to have a lover who was a prominent citizen, who was regarded as a virtuous person who could impart virtue to the youth. If a prominent citizen was infatuated with a particular youth, that youth would be seen by many as a lucky boy. Thus, the lover was not merely a predator looking for a youth to use for his own selfish gratification. He was expected to have a sort of disinterested love for the youth as well, and a sense of responsibility for facilitating the development of the soul of the youth. When the youth became a man, as said, the sexual affair ended and the two became platonic friends. This last element of the care of the soul that was supposed to be part of this erotic relationship makes sense of how Socrates could be seen as a master of the arts of love and as a great erotic. Much of the symposium is concerned with unpacking the ambiguity of this Greek conception of love that's rooted in the institution of man-youth educational love affairs. It's notable that the discussion of love in this work, which is really the first work on the philosophy of erotic love in Western history, hardly mentions the love between an adult man and an adult woman. The relation, the erotic relation that we moderns tend to assume is the standard case of erotic love. Instead, the Greek paradigm of erotic love involves a type of desire that today we have a cultural tendency to regard as shameful and scandalous, if not, in many cases, outright criminal. Today, the default cultural assumption would be that the beloved in the Greek relationship was being victimized and would no doubt suffer life-destroying trauma from the actions of the lover. The ancient Greeks, however, apparently thought precisely the opposite. And what this means for us is that we may have to stretch our cultural imaginations, our tolerance, and our powers of empathy in order to relate to the speeches of the symposium at times. In addition, it's worth mentioning, again, judging primarily from Possanias' speech, but also from some of the others, that there was an element of sexism in this relationship. The idea, the ideal of a kind of higher love, kind of heavenly love that was part of the relationship, was often couched in terms of the superiority of the masculine to the feminine. And so this is why the man sort of achieves a higher degree of love if he loves the soul of the man, which is superior to the body of the woman. So there is that element as well that we have to sort of tolerate as a violation of our contemporary sensitivities. So consider yourself duly warned that this isn't always grimace-free reading, I think, for the contemporary reader. There are elements here that can cause us to be uncomfortable. Okay. Turning to the text. The first thing we notice here is that Plato uses the same literary device he used in the Phaedo. The main body of the dialogue is a dialogue within a dialogue. And here, the principal narrator wasn't even present, so we have a second-hand report. Nevertheless, there's a shocking amount of detail for such a report, including the preservation of stylistic nuances and differences between the speeches. And so we're included in that this is not really a realistic portrayal of the way someone would recount an episode, but Plato's way of telling us something. It's a literary conceit. We can assume that the details are not intended to be historical or to necessarily represent the actual views of the characters, although it seems that they are characteristic views, the kinds of views that this person, given his personality, would have held. But they are all Plato's creations. Even though it seems that the characters were all actual historical figures. So there are several characters in this work, more speaking parts, so to speak, than any dialogue that we've looked at so far. And here, really, we get the sense of kind of proto-novelistic character to Plato's dialogue. There's also a repeated literary conceit of having people raise positions, views, proposals, and couch them as being not their own, but as reports from other people, supposedly. And this naturally raises a question about what Plato's purpose is in dispersing the discussion of erotic love among so many sources. It seems reasonable to assume that Plato wanted to represent the tensions and conflicts that existed in his culture regarding the concept of erotic love. One hypothesis would be that Plato uses the other speakers as foils for his own view, which according to the standard practice of Plato, or what is assumed to be a standard practice, is put into the mouth of Socrates. So Socrates speaks Plato's view. And the other characters are used sort of as personifications of opposing views and objections and so forth. Now, while this is a plausible hypothesis, a couple of factors might cause us some hesitancy. First, there's the fact that Socrates' position on love and beauty is said to be a mere recounting of a wise woman's position, that of someone named Diotima of the city of Mantinea. The historicity of Diotima is doubtful, since this work is the only ancient source we have for her, and as said, it's not a work of history. However, in favor of her historicity, scholars have sometimes pointed to the fact that all the other characters in the Symposium were historical. However, if she is historical, that would complicate the default position that when reading Plato's dialogue, Socrates is the mouthpiece for Plato. Here, Socrates, is a mouthpiece for Diotima. And then, of course, as we'll see in the next video, we have the theory of the forms being propounded by Diotima. So this raises a number of questions. Is Plato distancing himself from the theory of the forms by putting it into the mouth of Diotima? Or is he actually acknowledging that he got the theory of forms from her? He did mention, you'll recall in the Meno, that with regard to the theory of recollection, that he was recounting the view of certain priests and priestesses. And it would be plausible to think of Diotima as some kind of a priestess. We can also note that the episode between Socrates and Diotima is placed historically far before Plato wrote. The meeting preceded the Symposium, of course. Socrates is recounting it sometime later. But of course, the Symposium itself is placed by Apollodorus, the narrator, many years before. So if Diotima is historical, do we also conclude that Plato got the theory of the forms via Socrates from Diotima? Recall that in the Phaedo, Plato suggests that Socrates was holding a kind of esoteric knowledge, the kind of knowledge that was characteristic of the mystery religions of the Mediterranean at this time, where there were certain pieces of knowledge, secret doctrines that were typically salvific in their character, that is, that would lead the individual to salvation. And these doctrines were not told to just anybody, that one had to be initiated into the particular mystery in order to be able to receive these doctrines. And so, once again, we get the idea that the theory of the forms is cast as a kind of piece of esoteric knowledge that is to be handed down as a mystery. And Plato is suggesting here that he got it from Socrates. If we combine this with the Phaedo, that he got the doctrine of the forms from Socrates, who in turn received it from Diotima. So this is a very interesting suggestion and notion, and it's difficult to say exactly how seriously we are to take it, how much we are to take it as a literary construct, and how much we are allowed to take it as something literal. The question of why Plato put Socrates' speech in the mouth of Diotima certainly is an intriguing one to speculate about, especially given the overwhelming masculine atmosphere of the discussion. Diotima, as the high point, sort of comes in as the sole feminine voice in this very masculine discussion, which is not only, of course, a series of speeches that all come from men, but also that are about a form of erotic love that is exclusively masculine. And then here comes in Diotima. So, also, and this is the second point, there's the fact that Socrates' speech is not the conclusion of the dialogue, but rather the speech of Alcibiades is the conclusion, which is starkly opposed in manner and tone to Diotima's outlook on love. So it's not as simple as just saying, okay, Plato set this up so that these other characters are essentially mouthpieces for other perspectives on love. So we go through those, and then we get Socrates' perspective, which is the true one, the true Platonic perspective. He's the mouthpiece for Plato, and end of story. First, we have to deal with the fact that it's not Socrates' position; it's Diotima's position, according to the work. And then also, it's not the final speech; it's not the last word. You have Alcibiades coming in. So we'll have to be dealing with that in the next video as well. So this literary structure that I've just described complicates the natural assumption that the Symposium is a philosophical exposition of a theory about love and beauty, which begins by laying out opposing views before presenting the quote-unquote correct view. That may still be correct, but the way in which the communication of what we assume is Plato's view is blunted by putting in the mouths of Diotima and by interrupting it with the outrageous behavior of Alcibiades, at least raises questions about what Plato's attitude towards this official view was. The Symposium is also notable for the pervasive tension between comedy and tragedy throughout the work. Some parts that are ostensibly intended to be very serious and solemn are undermined by comedy and irony, while some obviously comedic parts contain an undercurrent of tragedy. It seems reasonable to conclude that this tension between the tragic and the comedic is part of Plato's ultimate verdict on the god Eros, whatever the official doctrine of Diotima says. All right, the setting. The tragedian, Agathon, still a young man, is holding a drinking get-together, the literal meaning of the word symposion, drinking together. And he's holding this in celebration of his victory at the tragic festival. So there was a practice that the Greeks had of presenting plays, as we would call them, tragic plays, in honor of a god, and as part of a festival for that god. And it would include a kind of contest where playwrights, tragedians, or comedians, the other form, would compete and to see who had the best writing ability, who could produce the best play, sort of like the Oscars. And so Agathon is one, and he's here having this party with his friends for a celebration of this. The Symposium had a conventional format, which is modified here, supposedly because the crowd is still recovering from the previous night's drinking. So there would be essentially drinking games that would pass around the room in order, and people would challenge each other, essentially like truth or dare or something like that. That is not literally what they would do, but you'd have a drinking game or something like that. And there would be flute girls there to entertain and so forth. But instead of this, they decide that they're going to have a more sober evening to recover from the previous evening's excesses. And so they're going to amuse themselves by having essentially a little improv contest. So very appropriate, a kind of a lesser version of the contest that Agathon had just won. This one is not going to be prepared, of course. They're just going to be giving little improvisational speeches in honor of the god Eros. So Eros, the name simply means love, and so you see it here translated as love. But one particular kind of love in particular, passionate, usually sexual love. So Eros is that kind of love, but it also refers to the god Eros, which became translated into the Roman context as Cupid. So we're familiar with Cupid on Valentine's Day cards and things like that. But that's Eros, but it's also love. So it's useful to think here of the Greek attitude towards the gods that we find vividly portrayed in Homer, for example. That a god was someone who could invade the soul. That in a paradigm example, two paradigm examples, when you all of a sudden find yourself in a situation of love at first sight, when you're passionately, driven to pursue the object of your love, and you're out of your mind, whereas perhaps before you saw this person a minute earlier, you were perfectly sober and in an even state of mind. Now all of a sudden you're just agitated and so forth. It's as if you had been given a shot of adrenaline or something like that. And the Greeks understood this as sort of the god coming into the soul, whether Aphrodite, the mother mythologically of Eros, or whether it was Eros himself who would come into the soul. Or to take another example, if you're on the battlefield and all of a sudden you just get a shot of aggressive impulse, this would be interpreted as the soul being invaded by Ares, the god of war. And one might go on a berserker rage, as we see portrayed in Homer's Iliad several times. So Eros is passionate, usually sexual love, as opposed to friendship or familial love. Philia, from which we get the term philosophy, and the name for the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, is an apt illustration. The philosophy is not erotic love for wisdom, but rather something like a kind of brotherly or familial or friendly affection for wisdom. Whereas Eros is a different kind of love. The divine personification of this kind of love is traditionally depicted as a beautiful boy or youth carrying a bow and arrow, or sometimes a lyre. He was originally considered as a primordial god in Hesiod and Parmenides, as one of the original gods. However, other myths make him the son of Aphrodite, who's the female personification of erotic love. And we see this played out in the speeches of Phaedras and Parmenides, for example. Not Parmenides, but Possanias. Parmenides is one of the people who thought that there was this original primordial principle, the god Eros. All right, so the conceit that sets the stage for the philosophical examination of love is the suggestion of Eryximachus, supposedly inspired by another character, Phaedras, that they all give speeches in honor of Eros, or love. So in the bottom of 205, we get the setup here. This is Eryximachus speaking. What I am to tell belongs to Phaedras here. There's one example of this deflection of, as it were, responsibility for what you're saying. Saying that this is Phaedras, over here, Phaedras' view. Here's an example of that I referred to earlier. It's a characteristic literary device in this work. What I am about to say belongs to Phaedras here, who's deeply indignant on this issue and often complains to me about it. Eryximachus, he says, isn't it an awful thing? Our poets have composed hymns in honor of just about any god you can think of, but has a single one of them given one moment's thought to the god of love, ancient and powerful as he is? As for our fancy intellectuals, they have written volumes praising Heracles and other heroes, as did the distinguished Prodicus. Remember Prodicus, the sophist. Well, perhaps that's not surprising. But I have actually read a book by an accomplished author who saw fit to extol the usefulness of salt. How could people pay attention to such trifles and never, not even once, write a proper hymn to love? How could anyone ignore so great a god? Now, Phaedrus, in my judgment, is quite right. I would like, therefore, to take up a contribution, as it were, on his behalf and gratify his wish. Besides, I think this is a splendid time for all of us here to honor the god. If you agree, we can spend the whole evening in discussion, because I propose that each of us give as good a speech in praise of love as he is capable of giving, in proper order from left to right. And let us begin with Phaedrus, who is at the head of the table and is, in addition, the father of our subject. It's interesting that Socrates immediately chimes in here, expressing his enthusiastic approval of this plan. And he says, this is in the passage immediately following what I just read, how could I vote no, when the only thing I say I understand is the art of love? This is remarkable and surprising, as I said earlier. Socrates, who claims to know nothing, knows love. That reminds me of those old Nike Bo Jackson commercials, which might be before your time if you're a youngin'. But Bo Jackson, there used to be these Nike commercials, which suggested that Bo Jackson knows all of the sports. You can search for them on this platform and find them. The Bo Knows commercials. So Bo knows everything, but Socrates, of course, famously claims he knows nothing except love. Socrates knows love. That's the one thing he knows. Well, what can this mean, that Socrates, of all people, knows the art of love, and that this is the only thing that he understands? I, for one, am intrigued. What is this art of love of which he speaks? Well, we'll have to wait for the next video to hear what Socrates says, because he speaks last. So first, we have in order the speeches of Phaedrus, Possanias, Eryximachus, Aristophanes, and Agathon. And these are presented as the highlights that Aristodemus could remember according to Apollodorus. So you have layer upon layer of identity here. So Apollodorus is recounting what Aristodemus told him, and Aristodemus is saying, well, this is what I remember Phaedrus, Possanias, Eryximachus, Aristophanes, and Agathon said. So that's the way this is contextualized. So first we have the speech of Phaedrus. Phaedrus is the title of Plato's dialogue of that name, which also concerns love. So apparently this was Phaedrus's hobby horse, his obsession. In the dialogue that's named after him, Phaedrus is shown to be a young student of rhetoric. And he seems to have, again, a particular fixation on the topic of love. In the Phaedrus, in addition to discussing love as a form of madness, which is the primary way it's presented there, Socrates develops an elaborate expansion of his theory of reincarnation and the soul. So it's interesting for those topics as well. Phaedrus begins by citing Hesiod, one of the two main Greek religious sources at the time, and the main source for the view that Eros is one of the primordial gods. On Hesiod's account, love is the primordial power that counterbalances chaos. Phaedrus equates the antiquity, the ancientness, the oldness, the antiquity of a god with the greatness of the goods that the god is able to give humanity. And that makes sense insofar as, on this mythological mindset, antiquity would correspond to power. So the older you are, the more powerful you are as a god, in other words. So what goods does Phaedrus have in mind that the god Eros gives to humanity? He says, this is 178c, quote, "I cannot say what greater good there is for a young boy than a gentle lover, or for a lover than a boy to love," unquote. So the greatest gift of Eros is erotic attraction of this type that I described earlier. The reason is not that erotic love is the source of ecstasies, or that it is so pleasurable or intense or exciting, but rather that it imparts a certain sort of guidance. So certainly from our modern perspective, when we hear songs about love songs, we're inclined to hear love praised as being the source of a kind of out-of-body experience of ecstasy or of some kind of intense, deep passion or emotion. And that's not the way that Phaedrus presents it. It's that love imparts guidance. And he's thinking here of the role in moral motivation of the emotions of pride and shame. So if you look, this is around 178e on page 206 in the left-hand column. What I say is this: if a man in love is found doing something shameful, or accepting shameful treatment because he is a coward and makes no defense, then nothing would give him more pain than being seen by the boy he loves, not even being seen by his father or his comrades. We see the same thing also in the boy he loves, that he is especially ashamed before his lover when he is caught in something shameful. If only there were a way to start a city or an army made up of lovers and the boys they love. Theirs would be the best possible system of society, for they would hold back from all that is shameful and seek honor in each other's eyes. Even a few of them, in battle side by side, would conquer all the world, I'd say. For a man in love would never allow his loved one of all people to see him leaving ranks or dropping weapons. He'd rather die 1,000 deaths. And as for leaving the boy behind or not coming to his aid in danger, why, no one would be so base that true love could not inspire him with courage and make him as brave as if he had been a hero. Phaedrus here is referring to a possibility that actually did come to fruition with the creation of the sacred band of Thebes around this time. Whether before or after this writing is disputed. And this is grist for the scholarly mill when they debate dating of these various things. But it is true that what Plato is describing here, whether because he's thinking that this actually exists or whether because he's prophetic, actually did come to come to pass. An army that was composed of lovers and their beloved, I guess precisely for this purpose of motivating these individuals who are members of the army to behave courageously in battle. Phaedrus goes on here to note that love also inspires a person, even a woman. So here's an expression of this kind of attitude that I alluded to earlier. But even Alcestis is inspired to noble deeds, such as dying for a loved one. Phaedrus goes on to note that even the gods approve of one who stands and fights for his lover, as Achilles chose to fight for Patroclus, which you might be familiar with from the movie Troy. But in Homer, and I believe also, if memory serves, in that movie, Achilles and Patroclus were not lovers. At least there's no indication that they were lovers. However, in Aeschylus, the great tragedian Aeschylus, they are lovers. So you see a bit of cultural evolution here and reinterpretation of this Achilles-Patroclus relationship, which Phaedrus here assumes is a relationship between a lover and a beloved. So Achilles, even though his mother had a premonition that he would die if he killed Hector, he didn't care. He still died for his lover. Achilles was sent to the Isles of the Blessed, Phaedrus says. And this shows the gods' approval of his brave action. So in sum, for Phaedrus, love provides a kind of divine grace. That's the main thing he's praising here, is the divine grace that erotic love provides that empowers mortal flesh to behave nobly and well and thereby earn not only honor among men, but even the approval of the gods. This is a very proper and pious attitude. Notice how Phaedrus seeks to justify the love relation between man and youth. And he does this by appeal to its good moral and pious effects. Phaedrus' attitude towards erotic love is thus moral and religious at its core. Such relationships have an almost sacramental character for Phaedrus. Turning to the second speech, the speech of Possanias. Possanias was a real historical figure. Evidently, he was a student of Prodicus and a lover of Agathon, which we see that referred to in this work, but not much more is known about him. Possanias began somewhat pedantically by insisting that they have to distinguish between two kinds of love. As Phaedrus drew upon the earlier mythological account of love that we find in Hesiod, in which Eros is a primordial power on a par with chaos and earth, Possanias draws upon the later, more personalized accounts of love as a child of Aphrodite. The complexity arises because there are two Aphrodites, hence two versions of Eros. So Possanias is grounding his account in scripture, so to speak. So he says there's two Aphrodites, and this implies that there are two Eroses. You know, probably we shouldn't think too hard on the logic of this, but evidently this is a kind of proof texting of his view that there are two kinds of Eros. And he grounds it in the fact that there are two Aphrodites. There's the older Aphrodite, the motherless daughter of Uranus, who is named Urania, or the heavenly Aphrodite. And corresponding to her is heavenly Eros. And for our purposes, that's the important thing. There's this heavenly type of Eros. So there's the heavenly Eros, and then that's in contrast with the other type of Eros, which is derived from the younger version of Eros, in turn derived from the younger Aphrodite, who is the daughter of Zeus and Dione, named Pandemos, or the common Aphrodite. And so corresponding to her would be the common Eros. So we have the heavenly Eros and the common Eros. Heavenly and common. The latter, the common Eros, is the love, Possanias says, that strikes common people who are vulgar in their nature, and they're attracted indiscriminately to women and to boys or to unintelligent people. They don't care about anything other than completing the sexual act. That's common. That's what common Eros leads to. And remember, think here of this idea of the god as sort of invading the soul when one is led to something, right? So if you're possessed, so to speak, by the common Eros, you'll sleep with anything that moves. And you don't care about their mind. You don't care about their soul. All you care about is, sexual release. That's the common Eros. By contrast, the heavenly Eros only strikes those who are attracted exclusively to the male because they are, he says, by nature stronger and more intelligent. So here we see the element of sexism, if not misogyny, potentially in the man-youth ideal of love in general within this subculture. How widespread this was, we can't say, but certainly Plato is indicating that some people sort of had this attitude that I only love youths because I only entertain this more heavenly form of love, and that means I'm only attracted to what's by nature stronger, more intelligent, better, and that's men. So there is that kind of sexual, sexist rather, connotation to this form of sexual expression for some people. Pausanias insists upon the pure-mindedness and the virtue of the man who is a lover of youths. He loves his beloved because of his desire to educate him and his attraction to his mind. This is a very high-minded idea. He says, this is page 208 in our text, around 181d in the top left corner of 208. He says, I am convinced that a man who falls in love with a young man of this age is generally prepared to share everything with the one he loves. He is eager, in fact, to spend the rest of his own life with him. He certainly does not aim to deceive him, to take advantage of him while he is still young and inexperienced, and then after exposing him to ridicule, to move quickly on to someone else. You can see in the background here this ideal that it was admirable and cause for celebration and jealousy and so on if there was a lover who could seduce many youths, moving from one to the next like a kind of Don Juan. And Possanias says the proper attitude is someone who would spend their whole life with them, which implies, in other words, that the relationship isn't primarily one about achieving sexual release, because after the youth, of course, grew into manhood, then the relationship would evolve into a kind of abiding friendship. And Pausanias says this is the proper idea. So basically, similar to the idea of someone who today who gets married to someone at a young age because they want to grow old with them, that they want to have a friendship with them that would outlast the period in which there's a strong sort of hormonal element to the relationship, when maybe they don't even have sex anymore, but they still have a love that consists in a friendship. That's the idea that Pausanias seems to be expressing here. The lover is of a heavenly variety only if his motive is pure, only if he is motivated by the love of the beloved's mind and the desire to contribute to the betterment of that mind. Similarly, there's only one good motivation or one heavenly motivation for a youth to give in to the lover's advances, a desire to learn from the lover and thereby improve in virtue. This is described, this is 184c, page 209 in the right-hand column towards the bottom. He says, there is one and only one further reason for willingly subjecting oneself to another which is equally above reproach, that is, subjection for the sake of virtue. If someone decides to put himself at another's disposal because he thinks that this will make him better in wisdom or in any other part of virtue, we approve of his voluntary subjection. we consider it neither shameful nor servile. You get the sense here that the real concern of this culture with homosexual relations was not so much in the fact that it was between two men or between two males, but in the idea of a man who was to be a respectable gentleman putting himself in a passive position, being a passive or receptive partner. And again, it's worth reminding here that the norm wouldn't have been penetrative sex, but it would have been a kind of intercrural. You can, if you don't know that word, you can Google it. Sex. So, but still, there would be the active partner who would be looking to obtain sexual release. That would be the lover, the mature man, and then the youth would be allowing himself to be used essentially as an object for obtaining sexual release by the lover. And it's putting yourself in that position of allowing yourself to be an object for someone else's sexual use that was considered to be troubling and potentially shameful. And so what Possanias is saying here is, it's not as long as the youth is doing this for the sake of being able to improve in virtue and achieve an education and so on. So it's no more shameful than someone who's a student putting themselves in a receptive position just purely intellectually in relation to a teacher. That is, you listen to what the teacher says, you aren't constantly, challenging the teacher's authority and so on. That you have to be in that kind of passive, receptive, intellectual position. And the physical position position of passivity is just a kind of extension of that. That seems to be Possanias' attitude. So again, as with phaedras, we see here an appeal to the moral justification of this erotic practice, but from the direction of the subject rather than the object, as in phaedras. Possanias claims that love is justified only when it is of the heavenly variety, which loves the beloved for their mind and seeks to benefit the beloved by improving them. And the beloved responds in an honorable way only when he subjects himself to the lover for the sake of improving in wisdom and the other virtues. The lover who is in love with his beloved's mind, rather than his body, is distinguished by the fact that he will remain with the beloved and their love affair will blossom into a permanent friendship, while the other sort of love will be a use them and lose them, or love them and leave them kind of situation. So this is the way he describes this. 209, he says, bottom of the left-hand column, in my opinion, however, the fact of the matter is this. As I said earlier, love is, like everything else, complex. Considered simply in itself, it is neither honorable nor a disgrace. Its character depends entirely on the behavior it gives rise to. To give oneself to a vile man in a vile way is truly disgraceful behavior. By contrast, it is perfectly honorable to give oneself honorably to the right man. Now you may want to know who counts as vile in this context. I'll tell you, it is the common vulgar lover who loves the body rather than the soul, the man whose love is bound to be inconstant, since what he loves is itself mutable and unstable. The moment the body is no longer in bloom, he flies off and away, his promises and vows in tatters before him. How different from this is a man who loves the right sort of character and who remains his lover for life, attached as he is to something that is permanent. We should note here that Possanias' view is in no way essentially tied to the man-youth homosexual relation, nor to homosexual relations in particular. A similar distinction, it seems, could be made for male-female erotic relations, and in both directions, male to female, female to male. So it doesn't depend upon this kind of asymmetry either. It could be that both partners alternatively occupy the position of the lover and beloved. And so the points that Possanias makes about the lover and the beloved don't necessarily apply to only one individual who occupies the fixed position of lover and only that position, or the fixed position of beloved and only that position. It could apply also to those who occupy both positions in an alternating way. So this leads to the first discussion question. First discussion question. Do you agree with Possanias' distinction between heavenly and common love and the value judgment that is inherent in this distinction? Is there really such a thing, in your view, as an erotic love that is primarily a love of the beloved's mind and a desire to help him or her reach his or her potential? Is such a love, assuming it is possible, superior to a purely physical attraction to the beloved's body? Explain your answers. So this is the first discussion question. Do you agree with Possanias' distinction between heavenly and common love and the value judgment that is inherent in this distinction? Is there really such a thing, in your view, as an erotic love that is primarily a love of the beloved's mind and a desire to help him or her reach his or her potential? Is such a love, assuming it is possible, superior to a purely physical attraction to the beloved's body? Explain your answers. All right, the speech of Eryximachus. Eryximachus is a medical doctor by trade, and he takes the scientific approach to love. And I think we can best read him and make him contemporary if we think of all of the ways in which the erotic is studied scientifically, or has been since, let's say, the late 19th century up until the present day. Eryximachus views love as, first of all, a general explanatory principle of nature that directs everything that occurs. Sounding like a modern psychologist, Eryximachus distinguishes between a healthy and a diseased love. So there's a healthy love and a diseased love. A healthy love is like a kind of balance among all the aspects of the body. In the left-hand column, this is around 186D, left-hand column of page 211, he says, in short, medicine is simply the science of the effects of love on repletion and depletion of the body. And the hallmark of the accomplished physician is his ability to distinguish the love that is noble from the love that is ugly and disgraceful. A good practitioner knows how to affect the body and how to transform its desires. He can implant the proper species of love when it is absent and eliminate the other sort when it occurs. The physician's task is to effect a reconciliation and establish mutual love between the most basic bodily elements. Which are those elements? They are, of course, those that are most opposed to one another, as hot is to cold, bitter is to sweet, wet to dry, cases like those. In fact, our ancestor Asclepius first established medicine as a profession when he learned how to produce concord and love between such opposites. That is what those poet fellows say, and this time I concur with them. This time. You get the sense there of the natural rivalry between the scientific mind and the poetic mind. So a healthy love is like a kind of balance between all aspects of the body. And here, he sounds a lot like Empedocles, as well as like a modern therapist who seeks to restore a chemical balance through psychoactive drugs. We need to restore the balance of the body, restore the balance of the chemicals in the brain. And then that's the healthy kind of love. Besides medicine, a whole series of crafts are guided by the aim of restoring the balance between things, or the love between them, which is the same thing for him. So he says, medicine is guided everywhere by the God of love, and so too are physical education and farming. Further, a moment's reflection suffices to show that the case of poetry and music are precisely the same. So love is like the principle of the universe, the balance between things. It includes the art of divination, which he sees as the art of restoring love between men and gods. Now, Eryximachus might seem to blur the idea of love as a metaphysical principle, like we find in Empedocles and perhaps Heraclitus, and the idea of love as an emotional state or a human relation. What's the relationship between the idea that love is this somehow, like in an extended sense, an all-pervasive metaphysical principle that directs everything into a state of balance and harmony, and the idea that love is an emotional state or human relation? Well, Eryximachus' perspective apparently is that what we think of as the human emotional state is just a kind of subset of this all-pervasive love. And this makes a lot more sense if we remind ourselves of this Greek idea of gods as invasive principles from the outside. Where there isn't this sharp divide between what's in the mind and what's outside in the physical universe. Eryximachus is also very modern in seeing a kinship and a continuum between physiological states of the body, which of course are just of a piece with the physical states of the universe in other forms outside of the human body, and the emotional states of the mind. There's a kind of kinship and continuum. It's not there's not a sharp divide. Also, Eryximachus' confidence in his abilities as a love doctor, his ability to direct and channel love through medicine, might raise an anxiety in us about our freedom to love or not love, about the possibility that love can be manipulated mechanically, whether by a medical doctor, some kind of diviner, or a modern chemist. Okay, the speech of Aristophanes, and this is one that you really need to read yourself and appreciate all the nuances of, because I'm not going to be able to go through all those here. Aristophanes, of course, was the famous ancient Greek comedic poet, playwright, author of such still famous works that are still regularly performed, like The Clouds and Lysistrata. He had started hiccuping during Possanias' rather moralistic and prudish speech, which no doubt is Plato's signal that Possanias' position is perhaps overly strict and takes erotic love too seriously. Aristophanes is the perfect corrective for over-seriousness, and he concocts a still famous fable or myth about love that's comedic to the point of being tragic. So remember, the account is, what's comic about it is that originally human beings were like we are now, except we also had the features of the face and the genitals and so on the backside as well as the front side. And they were much more powerful because they had all these extra limbs, and they would move by doing cartwheels, like rolling around, doing cartwheels. And so it's a very humorous image. And Zeus got mad because, of course, human beings, when they get too powerful, they start being prone to hubris and overreaching and overstepping their bounds. And so in order to make them less powerful, not unlike Yahweh in the Genesis account of the fall, when man becomes too powerful, the God has to put him in his place and deprive him of some of his power. And so it's a kind of account of the fall. As comedic as it is also tragic, because it is an account of how humanity fell from a more powerful and more perfect and complete state. And so what the God did was divide human beings into these two parts, such that we now go running around looking to reunite with our other half. And this is a pretty effective comedic send-up of the romantic cliche of the soulmate. But that hasn't stopped people from seeking their soulmate. As I said, there's an element of tragedy in this. It's a myth of the fall. Humanity has lost its completeness and wholeness. We are mutilated and deprived of our full nature, and we can never really get it back. So he describes this this long passage on page 214, beginning in the bottom of the left-hand column. He says, "And so, when a person meets the half that is his very own, whatever his orientation, whether it's to young men or not, then something wonderful happens. The two are struck from their senses by love, by a sense of belonging to one another, and by desire, and they don't want to be separated from one another, not even for a moment. These are the people who finish out their lives together and still cannot say what it is they want from one another. No one would think it is the intimacy of sex, that mere sex is the reason each lover takes so great and deep a joy in being with the other. It's obvious that the soul of every lover longs for something else. His soul cannot say what it is, but like an oracle, it has a sense of what it wants. Like an oracle, it hides behind a riddle. Suppose two lovers are lying together and Hephaestus stands over them with his mending tools, Hephaestus being, of course, the god of the blacksmithing, stands over them with his mending tools asking, What is it you human beings really want from each other? And suppose they're perplexed, and he asks them again, is this your heart's desire then? For the two of you to become parts of the same whole as near as it can be and never to separate day or night? Because if that's your desire, I'd like to weld you together and join you into something that's naturally whole, so that the two of you are made into one. Then the two of you should share life, one life, as long as you live, because you would be one being, and by the same token, when you died, you would be one and not two in Hades, having died a single death. Look at your love and see if this is what you desire. Wouldn't this be all the good fortune you could want? Surely you can see that no one who receives such an offer would turn it down. No one would find anything else that he wanted. Instead, everyone would think he'd found out at last what he always wanted, to come together and melt together with the one he loves, so that one person emerged from two. Why should this be so? It's because, as I said, we used to be complete wholes in our original nature. And now love is the name for our pursuit of wholeness and our desire to be complete. The tragedy is that the most intense lovers really feel something like this. And yet there is no such offer from Hephaestus, no possibility of melting together. Notice that in Aristophanes' myth, sexual love existed before it was connected with the possibility of reproduction. And heterosexual and homosexual love are equally original and of the same status. He says, why are some people homosexual, why are some people heterosexual? Well, it depended on what the other half was that you were originally welded together with. You weren't welded, you were originally created that way. The difference between heterosexuals and homosexuals is merely due to whether the other half you were cut off from was the same sex as you. So there's no sense that it was better to have an other half that was of the opposite type. In Aristophanes' account, reproduction through sexual intercourse is a later innovation. All right, so that's Aristophanes. And finally, we come to Agathon, finally for this video. Agathon complains that everyone before him had only praised the good things that come from the god Eros, the god's gifts. They were praising the god's gifts and not the god himself. They all followed Phaedras in this proposal that he had, is that the best way to praise a god is to praise the gifts that we get from him. And Agathon says, no, that's not my view. I want to praise him first for what he is. Praise him first for what he is. In other words, what Agathon will seek to do is essentially assemble materials for a hymn, that is H-Y-M-N, hymn, a song of praise to the god Eros. So he's going to be cataloging his praiseworthy qualities. Much as if you were thinking of writing a Hebrew psalm to Yahweh, you would catalog all his great qualities, his might, his patience, his kindness, his generosity, and so forth. Agathon, furthermore, seeks not only to produce a list of qualities, but to justify attributing each one to Eros. So what are these qualities? Well, first, he's the happiest of all the gods. He's the happiest of all the gods because he's the youngest and most beautiful. And everyone knows that young, good-looking people are the happiest people. This is why there's a multi-billion-dollar industry of products promising people eternal youth and beauty, right? So Agathon rejects the primordial tales about love that Phaedras keyed off of, which would make him an old god. He says, this is implausible. Those old gods were all into wars and castrations and stuff, and love isn't like that. So love's definitely a young god, and because of that, we can say he's the most beautiful and the happiest of all the gods. Second, love is delicate. We know this because he only settles in the softest places, in the character and hearts of soft-hearted and gentle men. So love is young, beautiful, happy, and also delicate. Third, love has a fluid, supple shape. A fluid, supple shape. In other words, love is flexible. Love is able to slip into and out of a soul unnoticed. And so we know he's very flexible. And fourth, love is virtuous. He's never the cause of any injustice or violence, nor does any violence or injustice affect love. Love doesn't force or compel anything. For example, no one affected by love is ever compelled to give anything. The person gives of its own accord. So this is the origin of the hippie slogan, make love, not war. Love is also moderate, temperate, which he sees because love gives men power over their passions. So love is temperate. Love is also brave, which we see by the way he makes others brave, as Phaedras noted. Love is wise because anyone who is touched by love instantly becomes a poet. And Agathon, who is a poet, assumes, of course, that the poets are wise. So love is wise. Love makes people wise. In sum, love is the most beautiful and best of the gods. Love, we might say, is the most lovable of the gods. He's the happiest, the most beautiful, delicate, supple, flexible, virtuous, meaning the most just, nonviolent, moderate, brave, and wise. Love is the most beautiful and the best of the gods, the most lovable of the gods. In the climax to his speech, Agathon also praises love as a great force of togetherness. This is on the right hand of 217 to the top of 218 in the left-hand column. This is how I think of love, Phaedras. First, he is himself the most beautiful and the best. After that, if anyone else is at all like that, love is responsible. I am suddenly struck by a need to say something in poetic meter, that it is he who gives peace to men and stillness to the sea, lays winds to rest and careworn men to sleep. Love fills us with togetherness and drains all of our divisiveness away. Love calls gatherings like these together. In feasts, in dances, and in ceremonies, he gives the lead. Love moves us to mildness, removes us from wildness. He is giver of kindness, never of meanness. Gracious, kindly, let wise men see and gods admire. Treasure to lovers, envy to others, father of elegance, luxury, delicacy, grace, yearning, desire. Love cares well for good men, cares not for bad ones. In pain, in fear, in desire or speech, love is our best guide and guard. He is our comrade and our savior. Ornament of all gods and men, most beautiful leader and the best. Every man should follow love, sing beautifully his hymns, and join with him in the song he sings that charms the mind of God or men. Finally, our second discussion question. Of the 5 speeches on love in the Symposium that are before Socrates' speech, which we've just gone over, which do you think best captures the nature of love? And which do you think is the most off base? Justify your answer. So the second discussion question. Of the 5 speeches on love in the Symposium before Socrates' speech, which do you think best captures the nature of love, and which do you think is the most off base? Justify your answer.